Brad, a combat veteran looking for peace, moves into a dilapidated old house in Michigan. But immediately, his retired canine, Ghost, begins to act strangely. He won't stop growling at a specific corner of the freezing stone wall in the basement. Trusting his partner, Brad pries a stone loose and discovers a modern ventilation duct. He snakes an endoscopic camera inside, and what he sees on the monitor makes him freeze. It's a high-tech, brightly lit underground bunker filled with industrial printers and millions of dollars in counterfeit money. But the worst discovery is a flashing red warning on a control panel. Temperature critical. System shutdown imminent. Brad realizes he's just found an active criminal operation, and they are about to return. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The old pickup truck, its suspension groaning under the weight of a life packed into boxes, finally turned off the county highway onto a road that was little more than 2 gravel tracks disappearing into the trees. The rumble of the engine was the only sound, a low vibration against the immense silence of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Behind the wheel, Brad kept his eyes forward, his knuckles white on the worn steering wheel. He was a man who looked older than his 43 years, tall and lean, with a deceptive strength in his long limbs. His short brown hair was trimmed neatly, a habit from a former life, but it was surrendering to a spray of silver at his temples. His face was austere and weathered, etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and a sun-scorched past. He wore his civilian uniform, a worn, unbuttoned flannel shirt of navy, gray and faded beige over a simple gray t-shirt, paired with faded blue jeans and heavy work boots. Beside him on the bench seat sat Ghost. The dog was a German shepherd, but not the common black and tan. Ghost's coat was a striking wolf-like gray and white, thick and dense for the coming cold. He was 6 years old, in the prime of his life, but his eyes held the same steady ancient vigilance as the man beside him. He was not a pet, he was a partner. A retired canine, now retired to a life he had never been trained for. Peace. Brad steered the truck through the dense forest of pine and towering birch, their white bark peeling like old paper. The air, even inside the cab, was cold and dry, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. After another mile, the trees abruptly opened up into a clearing, and they saw it. Their new home. It was a 2-story farmhouse, perhaps a century old, that had long ago given up any pretense of grandeur. The paint, once white, was now a memory, flaked away to reveal the raw, silvering wood beneath. The porch sagged, and a few windows on the upper floor were dark, empty squares. It stood on a wide, open plot of land, but the forest pressed in on all sides, a silent army of witnesses. Brad pulled the truck to a stop and killed the engine. The resulting silence was sudden and absolute, so deep it felt like a pressure against his eardrums. Ghost lifted his head, his ears swiveling, sampling the air. He let out a low huff, not of aggression, but of analysis. "Well, boy," Brad said, his voice rough from disuse, "this is it. Sanctuary." He opened the heavy door, the sound of its creaking hinges seeming to tear the quiet. He stepped out onto the cold ground, the crunch of dead leaves under his boots sounding unnaturally loud. Ghost vaulted out after him, landing silently. While Brad stared at the house, Ghost immediately began his patrol. His movements were economic, professional. He swept the perimeter of the truck, nose down, then moved toward the porch, his eyes scanning the tree line, his body low and alert. Brad watched him for a moment. They were 2 halves of a single, damaged whole. Both veterans, both carrying scars, Brad's were carved into his mind. Ghost's were hidden in the gaps of his training records. Their bond was forged not in affection, but in a shared, silent understanding of trauma. They didn't need words. They had been to the places where words failed. He walked to the back of the truck and unlatched the tailgate. Boxes, all of them marked in the same black stencil. Kitchen, bedding, tools, books, nothing personal, nothing that spoke of a life before. He had found the property on an obscure bank liquidation website, and foreclosure auction. The listing had been sparse, a few grainy photos, the acreage, and the words "sold as is." The price had been so low, it felt like a mistake. He later learned the previous owner, a name lost to county records, had died years ago, childless and without heirs. The house had sat, forgotten by everyone but the bank's ledgers. For Brad, the isolation was not a drawback. It was the primary selling point. He needed this silence. He needed a place where the sound of a car backfiring or a door slamming wouldn't send him diving for cover. He needed a place where the horizon was trees, not concrete, a place where he could finally, hopefully, outrun the ghosts of Kandahar. He just hadn't known, couldn't have known, that his desperate search for sanctuary had delivered him directly into a threat far more immediate than his memories. He believed he was anonymous. He was wrong. Ghost reappeared from the side of the house, his tail at a neutral assessing angle. He walked up to Brad and leaned his heavy shoulder against the man's leg, not for comfort, but for confirmation. "We are here. We are together." Brad reached down, his calloused hand sinking into the thick fur of the dog's ruff. "Let's see the inside." The front door was stuck, the wood swollen from the damp autumn air. He had to put his shoulder into it, and it opened with a groan of protest, releasing a blast of cold, stale air, the smell of dust, dormant mildew, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. It was dark inside. He stepped into what must have been a living room. Furniture, draped in dusty white sheets, looked like a gathering of phantoms. He walked through the downstairs, his boots echoing on the hardwood floors. A kitchen with peeling linoleum, a pantry, a steep staircase leading up, and a heavy wooden door that he assumed led to the basement. He left it closed. That could wait. He returned to the truck, Ghost shadowing his every move. They worked in silence, a familiar rhythm. Brad would carry a box, Ghost would clear the path to the porch, watch his back as he went inside, and then scan the perimeter again. The work warmed Brad, but the air was getting colder. As the sun began to dip, the temperature plummeted. The UP didn't ease into winter, it fell off a cliff. The light in the clearing turned a weak metallic gray. Far in the distance, through a break in the trees, Brad could see a sliver of the horizon. Lake Superior. It wasn't blue, it was a flat, angry line of iron gray, already churning, already brewing the harsh winter that would soon define their world. Brad set the last box on the porch and rubbed his hands together, his breath pluming in front of him. "First night, Ghost," he murmured. "Get the generator running, find the furnace. We'll be fine." Ghost stood beside him, but he wasn't looking at the house. He was staring intently at the woods toward the back of the property where the land dipped down toward an old collapsed shed and what looked like the ruins of an old mine entrance. A low whine built deep in the shepherd's chest, so low it was almost just a vibration. Brad put his hand on the dog's head. "Wolves, probably. They'll learn to stay clear of you." But Ghost didn't relax. His eyes remained fixed on the darkening trees, watchful, intelligent, and deeply, deeply unsettled. He could sense something Brad could not. He smelled the faint, unnatural trace on the air, a scent that didn't belong to the pine, the earth, or the coming snow. Brad just shivered, pulling the collar of his flannel shirt tighter. He turned his back on the forest and walked into the cold, dark house, unaware that his arrival had already been noted. The first 3 days were spent making the house merely habitable. Brad got the portable generator running, coaxing the old furnace back to life with a reluctant rumble. He and Ghost unpacked the essentials, establishing a rhythm of simple survival. The upstairs was a lost cause for now, cold and empty, so they confined themselves to the ground floor. Brad set up a cot in the living room near the stone fireplace, Ghost sleeping on a bedroll at its foot. On the 4th day, the real work began. Winterizing. The UP winter was not a suggestion. It was a siege. If he didn't seal the foundation, the cold would creep in, freeze the pipes, and make the next 6 months unbearable. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and a new tub of mortar, whistling softly for Ghost. The dog rose in one fluid motion and followed him to the heavy wooden door he had ignored since their arrival. He pulled it open, revealing a set of steep, narrow wooden stairs descending into darkness. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over them, carrying a sharp mineral scent mixed with the powdery smell of old coal dust. "All right, boy, let's see the bones of this place," Brad said, flicking on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a cellar built not of concrete blocks, but of large, roughly hewn fieldstones, fitted together a century ago. The air was frigid, noticeably colder than the ground floor. Empty shelves lined one wall, covered in thick cobwebs. In the far corner, a mountain of coal dust was piled against the stones, likely left over from the last time the house's original furnace was fed. Brad descended, his boots hitting the packed earth floor. Ghost followed, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the wooden steps, his demeanor immediately changing. Down here, in the enclosed space, his senses were on high alert. His nose twitched, and his head swiveled, cataloging the new scents. Brad set down the mortar and began his inspection, sweeping the flashlight beam along the foundation walls. He was looking for cracks, gaps in the old mortar, where the wind could force its way in. This was the kind of methodical work he understood. Find the breach, seal the breach. It was a simple, understandable mission. He started on the far wall, running his bare hand over the cold, rough stones. He found a few small gaps, marking them mentally for repair. Ghost, however, was not following him. The dog had stopped, frozen, in the back corner of the basement, the corner near the pile of old coal. "What is it, boy?" Brad murmured, turning the light on him. Ghost was rigid, his body lowered slightly in a posture of intense concentration. He was not looking at Brad. He was staring at the stone wall. Just rats, probably, or a mouse nest. Ghost ignored him. He took a cautious step forward, then another. He pressed his nose directly into a dark crevice between two large foundation stones, sniffing with short, rapid huffs. A low, uncertain whine escaped his throat. Brad sighed and walked over, shining the light where the dog was focused. "There's nothing there, Ghost. Just rock." As if to contradict him, Ghost let out a low, quiet growl. It was not a sound of aggression. It was an alert. It was the same sound he used to make in Afghanistan when he detected something that was out of place. A patch of disturbed earth, a scent that didn't belong. Brad's casual demeanor vanished. He knelt beside his partner, placing a hand on the dog's tense shoulders. "Show me." He put his own face near the wall. He couldn't see anything in the tight gap, but he could feel it. A draft. "Well, you found the leak," Brad said, partly relieved. "Good boy." He started to move away, but something made him pause. He put his hand back to the crack. The draft was steady, but it wasn't damp. A hole in a century-old cellar in the middle of the UP woods should be pushing in cold, wet air, smelling of damp earth and roots. This air was cold, yes, but it was perfectly, unnaturally dry. He pressed his ear against the cold stone, motioning for Ghost to be quiet. The dog stood silent, watchful. At first, Brad heard nothing but the pounding of his own pulse. Then he caught it. It was not a sound, precisely. It was a vibration, a deep subsonic thrum, so low it was felt more than heard. It was the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of a powerful engine running somewhere deep underground. It was the sound Ghost had likely heard the moment they stepped into the cellar. Brad's heart rate quickened. He pulled his head back and sniffed at the crack. The smell was faint, almost undetectable beneath the coal dust. It wasn't the smell of earth. It was a sterile, chemical scent. The sharp, acrid tang of ozone, like a massive computer running or an electrical substation just after a switch is thrown. His blood ran cold. Rats didn't make a sound like that. A leaky foundation didn't smell like that. "Back up, Ghost." Brad went to the workbench he'd set up in the living room and retrieved his longest, heaviest tool, a 3-foot steel pry bar. He returned to the basement, his movements now deliberate, his days of seeking peace already feeling like a distant memory. He jammed the chiseled end of the pry bar into the mortar joint above the stone Ghost had indicated. He put his full weight onto the bar. The old mortar was brittle, and it cracked, spilling gray powder onto the floor. He worked the bar deeper, leveraging it against the adjoining stone. The stone was loose. It had been moved before. With a final strained grunt, Brad heaved the bar downward. The stone didn't just come loose. It tipped and fell inward with a heavy, muffled thud, disappearing into a darkness beyond the wall. A cloud of dust and grit exploded from the opening. Brad coughed, waving it away, his flashlight beam cutting through the haze. Ghost stood at his side, growling low in his chest, his eyes fixed on the black hole. Brad shone the light inside. His stomach tightened. This was not a cave. It was not a collapsed section of earth. It was a rough-hewn channel about 2 feet wide, angling down and away from the house, heading directly toward the old, collapsed mine on his property line. And running through the middle of the channel, gleaming in the beam of his light, were 2 things that did not belong. The first was a cable. It was not a household wire. It was a thick, black, industrial-grade electrical conduit, as thick as his wrist, heavily shielded against the earth. The second, running alongside it, was a modern, insulated ventilation duct, wrapped in shining silver foil. They were new, they were clean, and they were active. The low, mechanical hum was louder now, coming directly from the dark tunnel. The smell of ozone was unmistakable. Brad slowly stood up, the pry bar heavy in his hand. He looked down at Ghost, who had not taken his eyes off the hole. The dog's unease when they first arrived, his staring at the woods near the old mine. It all snapped into a cold, terrible focus. He had not bought a sanctuary. He had bought a secret, and he and Ghost were now sitting directly on top of it. Brad stood frozen in the cellar, the beam of his flashlight fixed on the black, unnatural tunnel. The low, subsonic hum pulsed against his ears, a mechanical heartbeat beneath his new home. The dry, ozonic air spilling from the hole felt wrong, a sterile intrusion in the earthy dampness. Ghost pressed against his leg, the dog's low growl a vibration Brad could feel in his thigh. Brad's training, the instincts he had spent the last 2 years trying to bury, surged to the surface. This was not a random discovery. This was a threat. His sanctuary was compromised. "Easy," he whispered, his voice flat and calm. He reached down and gripped Ghost's ruff, a silent command for quiet vigilance. He did not investigate further. He did not stick his head into the hole. His first priority was concealment. He knelt, retrieved the heavy fieldstone, and carefully maneuvered it back into the opening. It slid into place with a gritty scrape, fitting imperfectly, but well enough to hide the tunnel from a casual glance. He used a handful of the loose coal dust to smudge the floor, obscuring the drag marks from the pry bar. He backed up the stairs, pulling the heavy door shut, the solid thud as it closed, feeling final. He was sealing the secret in, but he knew he was sealing himself in with it. In the dim light of the living room, he washed his hands at the kitchen sink, watching the gray, gritty water spiral down the drain. He looked at his reflection in the small, cracked mirror he'd hung by the door. The man who had arrived 4 days ago was gone. The lines around his eyes were sharper, his gaze flat and assessing. He went to his duffel bag and bypassed the comfortable flannel shirt he'd worn earlier. Instead, he pulled out his old brown leather jacket. It was heavy, stiff, and scarred with age, the insulation worn thin, but it felt like armor. He zipped it up, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house, and slid a heavy, tire iron-sized wrench from his toolkit into the deep inner pocket. "Ghost," he said. The dog was already at the door, waiting. "We're going for a walk, recon. Eyes open, boy." They stepped outside. The air was colder than it had been an hour ago, biting at any exposed skin. The sky was a uniform, oppressive gray, and the wind had a new edge to it. It carried the scent of deep water and ice. Snow was coming, and coming soon. Brad didn't need to follow the cable. The tunnel in the basement had been angled perfectly, pointing like a compass needle toward the one landmark on his property he'd been ignoring, the derelict mine. He moved into the woods, not on the faint trail, but parallel to it, using the trees for cover. His boots made almost no sound on the carpet of pine needles. This was a terrible, familiar feeling. The feeling of moving through hostile territory, the skin on the back of his neck prickling, every shadow a potential enemy. He hated how easily his body remembered it. Ghost moved like a gray phantom at his side, his paws silent. He wasn't panting or exploring. He was working. His head was up, his ears swiveling, his nose constantly testing the wind. He was covering Brad's flank, his gaze sweeping the woods in a practiced, systematic pattern. This was their old dance, the one they'd perfected in the dust and heat of a place 13,000 miles away. After a 10-minute walk through the dense stand of pine and skeletal white birch, the trees thinned. They reached the clearing. The place was a monument to decay. Directly ahead, a large mound of earth and rotted timbers marked the main entrance of the old iron mine, sealed decades ago. A rusted barbed wire fence sagged around it, punctuated by a faded red sign that read, "Danger, unsafe." And just to the left of it, exactly as the property map had shown, was the ore processing shed. It was in even worse shape than the mine entrance. It was a large, rectangular building, but the roof had partially collapsed under the weight of past winters, and one wall had fallen away entirely, exposing the dark interior. It looked like a single heavy snowstorm could finish the job and flatten it completely. Brad stopped, skepticism creeping in. This was the source? This pile of rotting wood? It made no sense. The hardware in his basement was new, sophisticated. This was an antique. He scanned the perimeter. No fresh tracks. No tire marks. He signaled Ghost, a simple downward motion of his hand, and the dog stayed put, watching the tree line as Brad moved forward. He slipped inside the shed through the collapsed wall. The air was thick with the smell of rust, old grease, and the droppings of raccoons. The floor was a graveyard of industrial junk, just as the summary had described. Heavy gears, sections of conveyor belt, and rusted-out oil drums were scattered everywhere. Brad swept his flashlight beam across the debris. Nothing. Just junk, silence, and decay. He was about to turn back, convinced he'd made a mistake, when he realized Ghost was no longer at the entrance. The dog had silently moved inside and was now standing in the deepest, darkest corner of the shed, partially hidden behind a massive, skeletal piece of machinery. What looked like an old rock crusher, its metal jaws red with rust. Ghost was perfectly still, his body rigid, his head cocked. He was staring at the back wall of the shed. Brad moved toward him, his boots crunching on fallen debris. "What is it, boy? What do you have?" He squeezed past the rock crusher, his leather jacket snagging on a piece of rebar. He shone his light where Ghost was looking. The back wall of the shed, or what should have been the back wall, wasn't rotting wood. It was steel. His breath caught in his chest. It was a solid, reinforced steel door, painted a dull industrial gray, set directly into the rock face of the hill. It was anchored, modern, and completely out of place. Brad stepped closer, his heart pounding a slow, heavy beat. This was it. This was the gateway. To the right of the handle, just as the summary had indicated, was a small black electronic keypad. A single tiny green light glowed on its surface, a beacon of active power in the dead shed. He ran his flashlight beam along the frame. Tucked into the corner, almost invisible against the rock, were the two things he was looking for: the thick black industrial conduit and the silver insulated ventilation duct. They emerged directly from the rock and snaked into the door's frame. And now, standing this close, the sound was overwhelming. The low, mechanical hum. It was not faint here. It was the powerful, steady thrum of a massive generator, vibrating through the rock, through the steel door, and up through the soles of his boots. It was the sound of a living, breathing operation hidden just inches away. Brad slowly stood to his full height. He looked at the powered keypad, the reinforced door, and the massive generator vibrating behind it. He looked at the collapsed, rotten shed built around it, the perfect camouflage. He understood. This wasn't some minor secret. This was professional. This was funded. This was dangerous. He placed a hand on Ghost's neck, the dog's muscles still tense. Ghost looked up at him, his intelligent eyes awaiting the next command. "Okay," Brad whispered, as much to himself as to the dog. "Now we know." He grabbed Ghost's ruff. "Back, slowly. We were never here." He backed out from behind the machinery, his eyes never leaving the door. He and Ghost retreated from the shed, melting back into the trees, leaving the humming secret undisturbed. The wind was picking up, and as they walked back to the cold, compromised house, the first hard, dry flakes of snow began to fall. Brad and Ghost retreated into the house, the steel door of the mine shed looming in Brad's mind, a gateway to a secret that vibrated with active power. He locked his own flimsy front door, the small click of the deadbolt feeling pathetic and useless. The snow, which had begun as light flakes, was now falling in thick, heavy curtains, swirling in the rising wind. The world was shrinking, the trees blurring into a white haze. Ghost paced the small living room, his nails making a restless click-clack on the wooden floor. He let out a low, anxious whine, sensing the change in his partner. Brad was no longer the quiet man seeking peace. The veteran had taken over, his body moving with a tense, coiled energy. "It's okay, boy. Settle," Brad said, but his voice was flat. His mind was a precise, cold machine, assessing the new reality. The electronic keypad on that door was a clear message. Do not enter. It was professional, powered, and almost certainly alarmed. Attempting to force it would be loud and, in all likelihood, fatal. It was a frontal assault he could not win. But he had to know what was in there. He was a soldier trapped in an unsecured position, and the enemy was holding the high ground. He needed intelligence, and he needed it now. His thoughts returned to the basement, to the tunnel, to the cable and the duct. The cable was power, a target he couldn't touch. But the duct was a vulnerability. It was an airway. It was his way in. He grabbed his cordless drill and a small battery-powered jigsaw from his tool chest, the tools he'd brought to repair floors, not to commit espionage. "Watch my back, Ghost." The command was old, familiar. Ghost immediately stopped pacing and sat at the top of the basement stairs, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on the front door. He was on duty. Brad descended into the frigid cellar, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the cold gloom. He set down his tools and pulled the heavy fieldstone away from the wall. The hum of the generator seemed louder now, and the sterile ozonic air hit him in the face. He knelt, studying the silver foil-wrapped duct. It was about 10 inches in diameter. He pressed his ear to it, but heard nothing over the generator's thrum. He selected a drill bit. The sound of the drill biting into the metal was sharp, a high-pitched whine that seemed to violate the silence of the house. Brad winced, but he kept going. He drilled a starting hole, then inserted the blade of the jigsaw. The saw's buzzing rattle was worse, vibrating through his hand and into the stone floor. He worked quickly, cutting a small, neat square, just large, enough to fit his hand through. He turned off the saw. The silence rushed back in, broken only by the subterranean hum. He went upstairs to his truck repair toolbox and retrieved the one piece of specialized equipment he owned. It was an endoscopic camera, a bore scope, with a 9-foot flexible fiber optic cable and a small handheld LCD monitor. He'd bought it online years ago to inspect a cracked engine block in his old truck. He returned to the cellar. He fed the tiny camera lens at the end of the cable into the hole he'd cut. He switched on the monitor. The small screen flickered to life, showing only the dark, corrugated insides of the duct. He pushed the cable slowly, carefully. 5 feet. 10. The generator hum was deafening through the camera's microphone. He kept pushing, feeling the cable meet a bend and turn downward. Then the screen exploded with light. He was through. He was looking down from a ceiling vent into a vast underground space. His breath caught in his throat. This was no makeshift hideout. It was a bunker. It was brilliantly lit by rows of sterile fluorescent lights. The walls were smooth, painted concrete, and the air was clear. It was warm. He could see no breath fogging the camera lens, no sign of the frigid cold that permeated his own house. He carefully manipulated the cable, twisting his wrist to pan the camera. He saw machines. First, a long, complex printing press, the size of a small car, gleaming and modern. Beside it, on wooden pallets, were stacks of large, cream-colored paper sheets. Pallets of it. He panned left. He saw a heavy industrial hydraulic cutter, and beside that, racks. Metal racks, like those used for baking, stretching 20 feet long. They were filled with drying sheets. He angled the camera using the zoom function. The sheets were green and black. He zoomed closer, the image pixelating slightly before snapping into focus. He was looking at uncut sheets of $100 bills. A cold dread, far deeper than the seller's chill, settled in his stomach. This wasn't a meth lab. This wasn't a counterfeit driver's license ring. This was industrial-scale currency counterfeiting. This was a multi-million-dollar operation, run by professionals, hidden beneath his feet. He kept panning the camera, his hand steady. He scanned the rest of the room. It was meticulous, clean, and empty. No people. Then he saw it. On the far wall, a bank of electrical panels, and mounted next to them, a large gray metal box with a digital display. The HVAC control unit, the source of the ventilation. He maneuvered the camera, pushing the cable to its absolute limit, zooming in as close as he could. The display was flashing, a bright red two-line warning, blinking in stark English. Filter error, temperature critical, system, shutdown imminent. The words seemed to pulse in time with the generator's hum. Brad stared at the screen, the implications hitting him one by one, like hammer blows. He pulled the camera out, the cable snaking back into the cellar. He didn't bother to tape up the hole. He didn't care. He replaced the heavy stone, his movements numb. He walked upstairs, the borescope monitor still clutched in his hand. Ghost met him at the door, whining, sensing the spike in Brad's adrenaline. Brad went to the living room window and stared out into the blizzard. The snow was a white vertical wall, completely obscuring the trees. The world was gone. He pieced it all together, the cold, hard facts of his situation. 1, the hum, the lights, the keypad. They had their own power. That deep, vibrating thrum was a massive diesel generator. They were off the grid, self-sufficient. 2, temperature critical. This high-tech printing operation, the inks, the solvents, the delicate paper, it all required a perfectly stable, warm and dry environment. That environment was failing. The cold he felt in his own house was their enemy. If that bunker froze, their entire investment, millions of dollars, would be destroyed. 3, system shutdown imminent. They didn't have weeks. They didn't have days. They had perhaps hours before the system failed and the UP winter began its work. They had to come back, and they had to come back now. He let out a shaky breath, and the final terrible piece clicked into place. This property was a bank foreclosure, a public sale. An operation this sophisticated, this valuable, would not just hope their ventilation shaft house stayed empty. They would know it had been sold. They would have been watching it. They knew he was here. They weren't just coming back to fix a filter. They were coming back to secure their operation, and that meant dealing with the one person who had been foolish enough to buy the house on the hill. He looked down at Ghost. The shepherd sat at his feet, looking up at him, his gaze steady, absolute, and ready. Brad realized his search for isolation had been a terrible success. He was miles from any living soul. The roads would be impassable in an hour. There was no one to call, no one to help. He and Ghost were completely, utterly alone, and the enemy was on its way. Brad stood at the window, the dead monitor of the borescope heavy in his hand. The snow was no longer falling. It was attacking, driven horizontally by a wind that was beginning to howl. The world beyond the glass was a frantic, swirling vortex of white. His mind was racing, replaying the blinking red warning. Temperature critical. He had 2 clocks. One was the failing HVAC system in the bunker. The other was the rapidly deteriorating weather. The thought that he could just pack up and leave, drive away, evaporated. The gravel track he'd driven in on was already invisible, buried under a fast-growing drift. He was trapped, but so were they. The thought offered no comfort. They were trapped out there. He was trapped in here, at the very center of their problem. He needed to know how long. How long until the storm made travel impossible? How long until their system failed? His eyes darted to the kitchen counter, landing on a small silver and black box, a battery-powered hand-crank radio. He'd bought it on his supply run to the nearest town, a cluster of buildings named after an old iron mine. He'd walked into Daryl's general store, a place that smelled of sawdust, old leather, and pipe tobacco. Daryl himself, a man with a face like a worn boot and eyes that had seen 70 Yuppie winters, had watched him pick it out. "You're the fellow who bought the old hemlock place," Daryl had stated, not asked. "Just Brad," Brad had replied, placing the radio, the heavy pry bar, and a bag of rock salt on the counter. "Radio's a smart buy. Weather here don't warn. It just arrives." Daryl had rung him up in silence, his skepticism about the newcomer a palpable thing. "That old house ain't seen a winter in a decade. Hope you know what you're doing, son." Brad now wished he could ask Daryl if knowing what he was doing included a multi-million-dollar counterfeiting ring. He picked up the radio and switched it to the weather band. The speaker hissed with static. He extended the antenna and turned the tuning dial, the small needle creeping across the frequencies. Suddenly, a clear, automated voice cut through the hiss. It was not a forecast. It was an alert. "A historic lake-effect snow warning is in effect for Marquette and Alger counties. A rapidly deepening low-pressure system over Lake Superior is generating extreme snow bands. Accumulations of 2 to 4 feet are expected, with localized amounts exceeding 50 inches. Brad's blood ran cold. 50 inches. The voice continued, devoid of emotion. "Beginning this evening and continuing for the next 24 to 36 hours, winds gusting to 60 miles per hour will create dangerous, life-threatening whiteout conditions. Travel is impossible and not advised. This is a life-threatening storm." Brad clicked the radio off. The house was plunged back into silence, save for the rising, mournful shriek of the wind as it hit the corner of the house. He stood perfectly still. The 2 clocks in his head suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. The criminals, wherever they were seeing this exact same report. They knew this life-threatening storm was coming. Brad put himself in their shoes, a tactical analysis he'd been trained to do. Problem 1. Your multi-million-dollar operation is about to freeze, destroying your product. Temperature critical. Problem 2. A historic blizzard is about to lock down the entire region, making your facility inaccessible for days, maybe weeks. Problem 3. A new, unknown variable, a veteran no less, is living directly on top of your ventilation shaft. They couldn't wait. They couldn't risk him calling the police. They couldn't risk their product freezing. They had to move now. They were in a race against the storm. And then, the final horrifying realization settled over him. The storm wasn't just a complication for them. It was an opportunity. It was the perfect cover. They could come in, likely on snowmobiles, which would be invisible in a whiteout. They could fix their system. They could deal with him, a single isolated man and his dog. They could leave. And by the time the storm cleared, 2 or 3 days from now, the snow would have buried all their tracks. The house would just be another silent, snow-covered tomb, his truck buried in a drift, his disappearance not even noticed for weeks. The storm was their accomplice. He walked to the back door and looked out. The snow was already calf-deep. He thought of his truck. The engine was cold-soaked. Even if it started, he'd never make the county road. Fleeing on foot was suicide. He was not running. He was not a victim. He was a soldier in a defensive position, and the enemy was inbound. The fear that had been gnawing at him solidified into something hard and cold. Resolve. "Okay, Ghost," he said, his voice calm. "Time to get to work." The shift was immediate. He was no longer a man trying to heal. He was a man preparing for a siege. His first move was survival. He filled the bathtub and every large pot in the kitchen with water, knowing the pipes would be the first to freeze when the furnace failed. His second move was defense. He went to the heavy antique sideboard in the dining room and with a grunt shoved it across the floor, barricading the back door. It wouldn't stop a determined entry, but it would make noise, and it would cost them time. He checked the locks on the main floor windows. They were old, flimsy. His third move was a weapon. In the bottom of his old Marine Corps duffel bag, beneath his folded clothes, was a long, flat wooden case. He hadn't opened it in 2 years. He laid it on his cot and unfastened the brass latches. Inside, nestled in dark green felt, was an old bolt-action rifle, a Winchester Model 70, chambered in .30-06. It had been his father's. The wood stock was dark and smooth, the blued steel of the barrel immaculate. It was not the M4 he'd carried for a decade, but it was accurate and it was powerful. In a side compartment, he found a small green and yellow cardboard box of cartridges. He slid them out, counting. 7 rounds. He chambered one. The sound of the bolt sliding home, a heavy, oily click, was incredibly loud in the small room. He set the rifle gently against the wall by the fireplace within easy reach. He dragged a heavy, overstuffed armchair and positioned it in the darkest corner of the living room, facing the front door and the staircase, giving him a clear line of sight to both. Ghost had been watching this entire process, his gray and white head cocked, his body tense. He knew this man. He recognized the economy of motion, the focused energy. This was not the man who tossed a ball or scratched his ears. This was the man he had served with. Ghost sat by the fireplace, his back to the wall, his eyes on the front door. He was no longer a companion. He was a sentry. Brad stacked his remaining firewood by the hearth. He checked the time. 4 p.m. The light outside was already fading, not from the time of day, but from the thickness of the snow. He sat in the armchair, the rifle leaning against it. He stared at the front door. He was ready for the storm. He was ready for the invasion. He and Ghost sat in the cold, dim room. The only light came from the flickering flames in the fireplace. The only sound was the rising, inhuman scream of the wind. They waited. The fireplace was a small, defiant flicker against the encroaching cold. Brad sat in the armchair, motionless, the rifle a heavy weight resting against his leg. He had been still for so long, he felt like part of the old, cold furniture. Beside the hearth, Ghost was a gray and white shadow, his body aligned with the door. He was no longer the restless, pacing animal. He was a statue of pure, focused potential, his head raised, his ears locked forward, tuned to a frequency beyond Brad's hearing. The house was silent, but Ghost was listening to the world outside. The wind had been a steady, rising moan for the last hour, but now it began to change. It was no longer just a sound. It became a physical presence, a deep, resonant whoosh that pressed against the house, making the old window panes rattle in their frames. The snow was a solid white sheet, a vertical river, erasing the trees, the sky, and the ground. Ghost moved. He didn't bark or growl. He simply rose from the floor in one silent, fluid motion, his body tensing, his gaze fixed on the front window. A low huff, a puff of air so quiet Brad almost missed it, escaped his nostrils. Brad's heart, which had been a slow, cold drum, gave a single hard kick against his ribs. He slid his hand from his knee to the rifle's smooth wooden stock. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Then he heard it, a new sound, a high-pitched, mechanical whine that pierced the deep bass of the storm. It was faint at first, then gone, then back, growing louder. It was the angry two-stroke sound of snowmobiles. Not one, multiple. They were here. He moved from the chair, a shadow detaching from the darkness, and crept to the side of the window. He stayed deep in the room, knowing any movement could be seen. He peered through the small, clear patch of glass at the corner of the pane. 3 headlights, like angry yellow eyes, cut through the swirling white. They were coming fast, not up the driveway, but along the tree line, heading directly for the derelict mine shed. The machine stopped, their engines idling high and tinny against the wind. 3 dark figures dismounted, their forms bulky and unnatural in heavy snow gear. Brad's focus sharpened, his breathing shallow. He analyzed the new arrivals, his old training taking over. 2 of the men were large, their shoulders broad, their movements heavy and confident. Even from 50 yards away through the blizzard, Brad could see the dark vertical shapes of rifles slung over their backs. These were the muscle. The guards. Cole and Rooker. The third man was smaller, thinner. He moved with a nervous, hurried energy. He wasn't carrying a rifle, he was struggling with a large, heavy silver case. A toolbox. This was Finch, the technician. The man they were waiting for to fix the failing HVAC. The scene played out in the swirling snow, a pantomime of intent. Finch, the technician, hurried toward the collapsed shed, clearly knowing exactly where the hidden door was. One of the larger men, Cole, clapped him on the back, a heavy, impatient shove that nearly sent the smaller man sprawling into the snowdrift. Cole then turned his head and looked directly at Brad's house. Brad froze, convinced he'd been seen. But Cole's posture was all arrogance. He nudged Rooker, the other guard, and pointed at the faint wisp of wood smoke curling from Brad's chimney. Cole laughed, a small puff of vapor visible even in the storm. He raised his gloved hand and made a slow, dismissive gesture, as if to say, "Look at that. He's in there, keeping warm for us." His intent was unmistakable, exactly as Brad had predicted. He gestured again at Finch, who was now fumbling with the keypad on the steel door, and then pointed back at the house. The order was clear. Let the technician fix the problem first. Then we go and clean up the old man and his dog. The steel door to the bunker slid open. A rectangle of warm yellow light spilled onto the snow for a brief second before Finch scrambled inside, dragging his heavy case. The door sealed shut behind him, and the small green keypad light went dark. Cole and Rooker remained outside. They were the sentries. They didn't seem to mind the storm. Rooker took a position near the shed, his back to the wind, while Cole began a restless circular patrol around the snowmobiles. Brad let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. This was it. The clock was ticking. Finch was inside, working on the system. How long would it take? An hour? 30 minutes? He had just backed away from the window, his mind calculating when the world ended. It happened all at once. The wind, which had been howling, escalated to a deep, unearthly shriek. It sounded like a freight train was passing directly over the roof, a sound so loud it was a physical weight. The entire farmhouse groaned, the old timbers popping and straining under a pressure they had not felt in decades. The small, bare bulb in the ceiling lamp, which had been burning a weak, sickly yellow, flickered once, twice. Then it died. A heavy click echoed from the kitchen as the ancient refrigerator's compressor spun down into silence. The power grid was dead. Brad's house was plunged into a profound, suffocating darkness. The only light in the entire world was the small, dancing flicker of the flames in his fireplace. The abrupt loss of the electric hum from the light, the fridge, the furnace fan was a shock. But its absence was immediately filled by the deafening, overwhelming roar of the storm. And the cold. It was no longer just a draft. It was an invasion. Without the furnace, the house's minimal heat began to bleed away instantly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees in a single second. Brad moved back to the window. He could see nothing. Not the trees. Not the snowmobiles. Not the shed. Not the 2 men. The world had ceased to exist. It was a total, absolute whiteout, a churning void of black and white. The trap had sprung. Brad was blind. He and Ghost were completely, utterly cut off. The house was no longer a fortress. It was a cold, dark wooden box. He backed away from the icy glass, a terrible realization dawning. Cole and Rooker wouldn't be standing outside anymore. They would have retreated into the bunker with Finch. They were in there, warm, safe, with light, with power from their own generator. He and Ghost were out here, in the dark, in the freezing cold. The tables had turned. He was the one exposed. He was the one whose survival was now measured in hours, not by the intruders, but by the relentless, killing cold of the UP winter. He sank back into the armchair, his leather jacket feeling suddenly thin. He felt the icy draft from the window cutting through his jeans. He was alone, but not entirely. He felt a familiar, solid pressure against his leg. Ghost had moved from the hearth. The big shepherd pressed his body firmly against Brad's thigh, a living furnace, a solid, unwavering presence in the freezing dark. Brad dropped his hand, his fingers sinking into the shepherd's thick ruff. Ghost didn't whine. He just leaned in, a silent, comforting promise. I am here. We are together. Brad's fear didn't vanish, but the sharp, paralyzing edge of his isolation softened. He was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the living, breathing, loyal soul at his side. He settled into the cold darkness. The waiting game had begun. The night was a void, a roaring, endless darkness. The storm did not lull. It screamed. Dawn did not arrive. The swirling white vortex outside the windows simply turned from pitch black to a blinding, oppressive gray. 24 hours passed. Brad and Ghost were prisoners in the freezing, dark house. The fireplace was their only god, a demanding, hungry deity. The firewood Brad had stacked was gone by the first morning. He had been forced to feed it. First, the old wooden kitchen chairs, which he broke apart with his bare, numb hands, the sharp snap of the dry wood sounding small and pathetic against the storm's roar. Then the drawers from the kitchen cabinets. They were in a stalemate. The house grew colder. The temperature in the living room hovered just above freezing. Brad, wearing every layer of clothing he owned, including his leather jacket, sat in the armchair. The rifle never left his side. He and Ghost shared their last 2 protein bars, splitting them in silence. Outside, he knew the snow would be massive, drifts that were feet, not inches, deep. The house was a tiny cold island in a sea of frozen white fury. And somewhere, just 50 yards away, the 3 men were warm. They were in their bunker, lit by fluorescent lights, breathing warm, filtered air, drinking coffee, waiting. The thought was a cold knot in Brad's stomach. They were waiting for the storm to break or for him to freeze, whichever came first. He was pinned down, trapped, waiting for an enemy he could not see, in a cold, dark, confined space. The afternoon of the second day, the wind found a new voice. It had been a constant, deep roar, but now a new, harmonic, high-pitched shriek began as the wind tore past the corner of the brick chimney. It was a piercing, tearing sound, like metal ripping apart. Brad had been staring into the fire, his mind numb with cold and exhaustion. But that sound cut through him. He had heard it before. It was the sound a rocket-propelled grenade made just before impact, that high, whistling scream. He flinched, his head snapping up, his heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the window, but he didn't see the swirling white snow. He saw the swirling brown dust of the Kandahar Valley. The smell of burning pine from the fireplace was gone, replaced by the acrid, chemical stink of diesel fumes and cordite. The cold from the drafty floor vanished, replaced by a phantom, shimmering heat that baked his skin. "Contact!" a voice screamed in his memory. "Contact! Right!" Brad's body went rigid. He was no longer in an armchair in Michigan. He was in the back of a stalled Humvee, the air thick with smoke, the world outside a blur of chaotic, deafening noise. Ghost, sitting at his feet, whined. A deep, nervous sound. Brad didn't hear him. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the living room wall, but he was watching a mud brick compound 1,000 yards away. He was paralyzed. Te liet. He was having a flashback. The sensory deprivation of the whiteout, the absolute silence beneath the wind, the feeling of being besieged, and now this sound, the shriek of the wind, had combined to unlock the box he kept chained in the back of his mind. He was lost. His breathing became shallow, his body locked in a cold sweat. He was useless. He was the man who had frozen, the man whose partner had... He was gone. Ghost knew this man. He had seen it before, in the moments after a patrol, when the adrenaline faded and the shaking began. He had been trained for this. He saw his partner, his alpha, staring at nothing, his scent changing to the sharp, bitter smell of raw fear. Ghost moved, his duty clear. First he whined, a low, urgent plea. He pushed his heavy head against Brad's knee. Brad did not respond. He was staring, unseeing, at the wall. Ghost whined again, louder this time, a sound of rising distress. He stood up and pushed his cold, wet muzzle hard under Brad's limp, frozen hand, trying to force a reaction. Nothing. Brad was in Kandahar. The dog's training took over. This was no longer a request for comfort. It was an intervention. Ghost lifted a heavy, gray and white paw and raked his claws firmly down Brad's thigh, just hard enough to be felt through the denim and leather. Brad flinched, but his eyes remained distant, locked on the memory. Ghost saw he was losing him. He escalated again, his actions now sharp, almost frantic. He moved in front of the chair, reared up, and placed both front paws on Brad's chest. He let out a single, sharp, distressed whine, a sound that was almost a bark. Then he did the one thing that could cut through the phantom dust and heat. He shoved his face forward and licked Brad's face, a long, rough, warm, and wet drag from his jaw to his temple. The sensation was a shock. It was not dust. It was not heat. It was not gunfire. It was wet. It was warm. It was real. Brad's body shuddered, a violent, full-body tremor. He blinked. Once, twice. The mud brick compound dissolved. The sound of shouting faded. The high-pitched shriek of the RPG softened, becoming once again the sound of wind against a chimney. He was in his house. It was dark. It was freezing, and a large, terrified German shepherd was standing on his chest, staring into his eyes, his warm breath fogging in the cold air. "Ghost," Brad whispered. The word was a dry croak. He wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the coarse fur. He was shaking, the adrenaline of the flashback leaving him weak and nauseated. Ghost leaned into him, absorbing the tremors, whining softly, his mission complete. Brad held on, grounding himself. The fear of the war, the paralyzing terror of the memory, slowly receded. It was replaced by the clarity of the present. The present was this. He was in a cold house. The storm was real. The men in the bunker were real, and this dog, this brave, loyal partner who had just pulled him back from the abyss, was real. He was not a soldier freezing in a Humvee. He was a man in his home. He pushed Ghost gently off his chest and looked at him, really looked at him. The dog's intelligent amber eyes were filled with concern. "Good boy," Brad breathed, his voice thick. "Good boy. I'm here. I'm here." He wasn't just here for himself. He was here for Ghost. The realization settled over him, displacing the last of the panic. He was not just a target, waiting to be dealt with. He was a protector. He had a duty. He had to get them both through this, not just the storm, but the men who were coming. He stood up, his body aching from the cold and the tension, but his mind was clear. The flashback was over. The paralysis was gone. He stroked Ghost's head, his touch firm. "Okay, we're done waiting." The change, when it came, was not a sound. It was a pressure, a shift in the subterranean hum that Brad had become attuned to over the last 24 hours. Ghost felt it first. The shepherd, who had been a solid, warm presence at Brad's leg, went utterly rigid. His head lifted, his ears locking forward, his gaze fixed on the front door. A low, menacing growl began to vibrate deep in his chest. Brad's hand, which had been resting in the dog's fur, was now steady. The panic was gone, scrubbed clean by Ghost's intervention. All that remained was a cold, sharp clarity. Then he heard it. Through the relentless scream of the wind, a new sound, the heavy, metallic scrape of the bunker door sliding open. They were coming. Brad rose from the armchair, melting into the deepest shadows of the room, near the cold fireplace. He left the rifle. It was too long, too slow for what was about to happen. This would be close. He slid the heavy, tire-iron-sized wrench from the hearth its cold metal a solid, reassuring weight. He moved to the edge of the window. Through the impossible swirling white, he saw them. Two silhouettes, dark and massive against the gray-white chaos. Cole and Rooker. They had their rifles but held them loosely, pointed at the ground. They were arrogant, walking with a confident rolling gait, their heads ducked against the driving snow. They were two men coming to do a chore. To them, Brad was not a threat. He was a loose end. An old man and his dog, already half-frozen, waiting to be put down. Brad watched them step onto the porch, their boots making a heavy, stomping sound as they kicked the snow from their gear. "Let's get this over with," Brad heard one of them, Cole, yell over the wind. "It's freezing out here." Brad moved back, flattening himself against the stone of the chimney. He gave Ghost a silent hand signal, a flat palm held low. Wait. The front door did not open. It exploded. A single heavy kick shattered the old lock and the rotting jamb. The door flew inward, slamming against the wall with a sound like a gunshot. It unleashed the storm into the house. A tidal wave of snow, ice, and wind blasted into the room, extinguishing the fireplace's weak flames in an instant, plunging the world into absolute, freezing darkness. Two massive figures filled the doorway, blocking the gray light of the storm. "Old man," Cole's voice bellowed, authoritative and impatient. "We know you're in here. Put a light on." The other man, Rooker, raised his rifle, fumbling with a flashlight attached to its barrel. He was trying to get his bearings, his eyes useless in the sudden transition from the whiteout to the pitch black. It was the only opening they would get. Brad's mind was silent, focused. He was not in Kandahar. He was in his home. "Ghost," he commanded, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the wind. "Jets. B." The word was a release. Ghost exploded from the shadows. He was not a pet. He was a weapon system. 90 pounds of muscle and canine training, moving with a speed that was terrifying. He didn't bark. He didn't warn. He launched himself across the room. Rooker, blinded, heard the movement and tried to turn. He was too late. Ghost's attack was exactly as he had been trained. He bypassed the man's body and slammed his entire weight, jaws first, into the target, the rifle, and the arm holding it. Rooker screamed, a high, piercing sound of pain and surprise. The sound of his rifle clattering on the hardwood floor was lost in the chaos. The man went down, crashing hard against the barricade Brad had built. Ghost's teeth locked on his arm, thrashing, neutralizing the primary threat. The attack had taken less than a second. Cole, who had been turning to follow Rooker, was momentarily stunned by the sheer violence of the shepherd's assault. He never saw Brad. Brad moved in the chaos, and he lunged from the shadows, his leather jacket absorbing the sound of his own movement. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the man. He slammed his full weight into Cole, driving him backward, out of the living room and into the narrow, pitch-black hallway. It was close quarters. Brad had the advantage of knowing the terrain. Cole had the advantage of size and strength. They crashed against the wall, Cole letting out a roar of rage. He was bigger, stronger, and felt Brad's relative weakness, his lack of body weight. Even in the dark, Cole shoved a heavy, gloved hand into Brad's chest and pushed hard. Brad was exhausted. He was cold. His feet slipped on the snowy floor. He stumbled backward, his boot catching on the edge of a floor rug. He fell hard, his head connecting with the wall, the world spinning for a second. Cole was on him in an instant, a massive dark shape pinning him to the floor. A heavy knee crushed Brad's chest, forcing the air from his lungs. "You're done, old man," Cole spat, his voice a triumphant snarl. Brad saw the man's other hand move. He was fumbling inside his heavy parka. He pulled something free. Even in the absolute darkness of the hallway, Brad saw it. A glint of steel. A knife. The glint. The close-quarters threat. The weight on his chest. The world stopped. The screaming of the wind faded, replaced by the sound of shouting in a language he half remembered. The smell of snow and old wood was gone, replaced by dust and the metallic tang of blood. He was back in the Humvee. He was pinned. He couldn't breathe. He was freezing, paralyzing, useless. Brad. No, not Brad. The sound was a furious, throaty animal roar that was not human. Ghost. The shepherd, his primary target neutralized, had heard the fight. He saw the secondary threat, the blade rising, the man pinning his partner. Ghost launched himself again. He flew into the hallway, a gray and white blur. He didn't go for the knife. He went for the man. His jaws, bred for power, locked onto Cole's shoulder, right through the heavy winter coat. Cole screamed, an agonizing bubbling sound, as teeth punched through nylon and muscle. The knife clattered to the floor. Ghost planted his paws and pulled, using his entire body weight, ripping the massive man off Brad's chest. Brad gasped, sucking in a lungful of freezing air. The flashback shattered. The dust of Kandahar vanished. He was on his floor. His dog was saving his life. Cole was on his feet, trying to swing at the dog, to get his knife, but Ghost was a whirlwind, snapping and snarling, keeping him off balance. Brad scrambled up. He felt the cold wood under his hands. He saw the dark shapes in the dim gray light from the open door. A new feeling, purer and colder than any rage he had ever known, flooded his system. It wasn't the hot, chaotic rage of war. It was the icy, absolute fury of a protector. This was not a soldier. This was not a target. This was his home. That was his dog. He didn't hesitate. He didn't make a sound. While Cole turned, distracted by the attacking shepherd, Brad lunged forward. He moved with a speed that belied his exhaustion. He was no longer a soldier following rules of engagement. He was an animal defending his den. He drove his shoulder into Cole's side, and as the man staggered, Brad finished it. A short, brutal sequence of blows aimed with precise anatomical knowledge. Cole collapsed, a heavy, boneless weight, and did not move. The fight was over. The hallway was suddenly silent, the world returning. There was only the roar of the wind, the crackle of the now dead fire, and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Ghost stood over the body of Cole, a low, warning growl still rumbling in his chest. Brad reached out, his hand shaking, and placed it on the dog's head. The shepherd stopped growling, leaned his heavy head into Brad's hand, and let out a shaky whine. Brad was alive. He was cold, he was home. The silence in the hallway was a heavy, cold blanket, broken only by the shriek of the storm and Brad's own ragged, painful gasps. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving behind a cold, deep exhaustion and the sharp, throbbing burn in his left forearm. Ghost was still standing over Cole's motionless body, the fur on his neck raised, a low growl still vibrating in his chest. "Enough," Brad's voice was a raw whisper. "Stand down, boy. Janug?" The shepherd's growl subsided, but he did not move, his eyes locked on the dark shape on the floor. Brad used the wall to pull himself to his feet. His first priority was to check his partner. He fumbled in his pocket for the small flashlight he'd stashed, his fingers numb. He clicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness. Ghost was bleeding. A dark, wet patch was spreading on his left shoulder, where Cole must have caught him with the knife in the struggle. "Okay, buddy. Okay," Brad murmured, his voice gentle. He ran his hand over the wound. It was a clean slice, but it wasn't pumping. It wasn't deep. It could wait. Next, the intruders. He shone the light on Cole. The big man was unconscious, breathing in shallow, wet rasps, but alive. He turned the beam to the hallway entrance. Rooker was still crumpled against the sideboard, moaning, clutching the arm Ghost had mangled. He was also alive. He had 2 live, dangerous enemies in his house and a third, unknown variable, in a bunker 50 yards away. Brad's mind was a cold, pragmatic ledger. He could not guard them. He could not leave them here. He had to secure them. He went to his supply boxes and retrieved a coil of heavy-duty rope and a roll of duct tape. His left arm was a screaming fire. He shone the light on it. The sleeve of his leather jacket and the flannel shirt beneath were soaked in blood. Cole's knife had sliced him from elbow to wrist. It was bad. Not now. Move. He went to Cole first. He rolled the heavy man onto his stomach, the movement sending a jolt of agony up his own injured arm. He bound Cole's hands behind his back with the rope, then wrapped his ankles. He used the duct tape to secure the bindings, and then, as a final, harsh precaution, wrapped a strip over the man's mouth. One down. He moved to Rooker. The man looked up at him, his eyes wide with pain and fear. "My arm! He broke my arm!" Brad said nothing. He offered no comfort. He just grabbed Rooker's good arm and bound him, just as he had Cole. Rooker tried to struggle, but he was weak from shock and blood loss. Brad secured him and gagged him. 2 down. Now, where to put them? He couldn't leave them here. The basement, the cold, dark stone cellar. It was the only place. He grabbed Cole by the collar of his parka. The man was a dead weight. Brad, with only one good arm, had to drag him inch by agonizing inch across the living room floor, his boots slipping in the snow that had blasted through the open door. He reached the basement steps. He opened the door, the black, frigid air washing over him. He shoved Cole's body onto the steps, letting gravity do the work. The man tumbled down the narrow staircase, landing with a heavy, sickening thud on the packed earth floor below. Brad took a moment, leaning against the doorframe, his vision spotting. One more. He went back for Rooker. As he was dragging the second man past the open front door, a new sound cut through the wind. It was the high-pitched, frantic whine of a snowmobile engine. Finch. Brad dropped Rooker's leg. He realized what was happening. Finch, the technician, warm and safe in the bunker, must have been waiting. His men were supposed to be back. They weren't. He had probably cracked the steel door, listening, and had heard the screams of Cole and Rooker, the furious animal snarling of Ghost. He knew, and he was running. Brad's first instinct was to let him go, but he couldn't. He was a witness. He grabbed his rifle, the one he'd left by the hearth. He stumbled to the open doorway, the rifle heavy in his good hand, his wounded arm held uselessly against his chest. He stepped onto the porch. The storm hit him like a physical blow. The wind and ice crystals tore at his exposed skin, blinding him. He raised his wounded arm to shield his face, a scream of pain catching in his throat. Through the whiteout, he saw it. The single bright headlight of the snowmobile, not 30 yards away. Finch was on it, a dark, frantic shape. He had a bag slung over his shoulder, the money. Finch gunned the engine. He was panicking. In the total, disorienting whiteout, he had no idea which way the road was. He was just running. The snowmobile shot forward, fishtailing. Brad raised the rifle, his good hand supporting the stock, his injured arm screaming in protest. He tried to acquire a target, but the pain, the wind, and the snow made it impossible. He had 7 bullets. He couldn't waste one. He lowered the rifle. He didn't need to shoot. He knew this place. He knew this cold. He knew what the wind chill was. Finch, blinded by snow and panic, had his direction completely wrong. He wasn't aiming for the track. He was aiming directly for the densest part of the Hiawatha National Forest. "He won't last an hour," Brad whispered into the wind. As if to prove his point, the headlight beam swung wildly to the left. The high-pitched whine of the engine was suddenly joined by a percussive, splintering sound of impact, a heavy crash as the machine hit something solid. The engine noise died. The headlight vanished. The sound was swallowed instantly by the storm. Silence. Finch was gone. Justice delivered by the Upper Peninsula itself. Brad stood on the porch for a long moment, the snow building on his shoulders, his own blood dripping from his arm onto the porch boards, freezing instantly. He turned, staggered back inside, and closed the broken front door, the wind still shrieking through the gaps. He shoved the heavy sideboard back in front of it, the scraping sound loud in the quiet house. The immediate threat was over. Now, survival. He lit an old kerosene lamp, the warm yellow light pushing back the shadows. Ghost. Calm. The dog limped over, leaving small, bloody footprints on the floor. Brad collapsed by the hearth. He ripped a strip from a clean t-shirt and gently cleaned Ghost's wound. It was exactly as he'd thought, a clean slice, shallow. The dog whined, but stood perfectly still, trusting him. "You're okay, boy," Brad murmured. "You're okay. You saved me. You saved me, Ghost." He finished cleaning the cut, then took care of his prisoners. He dragged Rooker the rest of the way to the basement and shoved him in, closing and locking the heavy wooden door on the two men. They would not freeze to death down there, but they would not be comfortable. It was more than they deserved. Finally, himself. He slumped into the armchair. He pulled his leather jacket off, hissing in pain. His sleeve was stuck to the wound. He had to grit his teeth and tear it free, a fresh wave of nausea washing over him. The cut was long and deep, gaping. It needed stitches. He had none. He retrieved his first aid kit. He poured antiseptic peroxide directly into the wound. The white, foaming burn so intense, it made his vision go white. He gasped, his body rigid, but he didn't stop. He took the sterile butterfly closures and, one by one, with a shaking hand, began the slow, agonizing process of pulling the two sides of his own flesh together, sealing the gash. He wrapped it tightly with gauze. It would have to do. He was alive. He was badly injured. He was exhausted. He looked at the broken door, the snow drifting into his living room. He looked at the locked basement door. He looked at Ghost, who had limped onto his cot and curled up, his eyes never leaving him. Brad put his head in his one good hand. The storm roared outside, a defeated monster. He had survived. The battle was over, but the war for survival had just begun. The storm raged for another full day. The house, with its broken door, was a cold trap. Brad and Ghost huddled by the dying fire, a single kerosene lamp their only light. Brad had used the last of the broken chairs. There was nothing left to burn. The cold was a living thing, seeping into his bones. His arm throbbed, a dull, deep ache under the tight, blood-caked gauze. He and Ghost were a portrait of shared misery. They took turns sleeping, one always watching. Brad would drift into a cold, fitful doze, only to be woken by Ghost's low whine as the dog shivered, his wounded shoulder stiffening in the cold. Brad would pull the cot's thin blanket over the shepherd, rubbing the dog's ribs to generate warmth, his own good hand numb. They finished the last of the bottled water, the last of the protein bars. The two men in the basement were silent. Brad had checked on them once. They were alive, miserable, and no longer a threat. Then, on the morning of the third day, Brad woke, not to the scream of the wind, but to silence. The sudden, absolute quiet was more shocking than the storm itself. It was a vacuum, a world muffled under feet of snow. He stood, his joints stiff, and looked out the window. The world was gone, replaced by a new one. It was a landscape of impossible, brilliant white, sculpted by the wind into massive drifts. The sun was out, a cold, distant disk, and the light reflecting off the snow was blinding. He knew with a sinking certainty that no one was coming. No plow would clear his track for weeks. He had no power, no heat, and no food. He looked at Ghost. The dog looked back, his amber eyes weak but trusting. Brad had not survived Kandahar, had not survived a 2-day siege in his own home, to die of starvation. He pulled his bloody leather jacket back on, wincing as the movement tore at his wound. He checked his prisoners in the cellar one last time. They were alive. He left them food and water. He grabbed the keys from Cole's pocket. He went outside, the Arctic air scorching his lungs. The 3 snowmobiles were almost completely buried. He dug at the first, Finch's, the one that had crashed. It was a twisted wreck, frozen against the trees. He dug at the other 2. One, Rooker's, had a broken track. The third, Cole's, looked functional. He climbed onto the seat, his wounded arm held tight to his chest. He turned the key. The engine was cold, reluctant. He tried again. The machine sputtered, a cloud of blue smoke puffing from the exhaust. On the third try, the engine caught, its high-pitched, angry whine tearing the new silence. He turned to the house. Ghost was standing in the broken doorway, watching him, his head low. "I'll be back, boy," Brad said, his voice a raw croak. Wah! Ghost did not move. He just watched, a silent gray and white sentinel, as Brad pointed the machine toward the highway and accelerated, disappearing in a spray of powder snow. The journey was a new kind of hell. It took hours. The snow was deep, soft, and treacherous. He crossed frozen streams, navigated by the tops of buried fences. His arm was a constant throbbing agony. Several times the machine bogged down, and he had to use his one good arm and his legs to heave it free, his body screaming in protest. He was cold, dizzy from blood loss, but he kept going. He finally reached the county highway. It was just another white, empty expanse, indistinguishable from the forest, marked only by the absence of trees. He stopped the machine, the silence rushing back. He was alone. He was about to give up, to lie down in the snow, when he heard it. A deep, low rumble, a vibration in the earth. A mile down the road, a massive, bright orange Michigan Dot snowplow was moving toward him, a column of black diesel smoke rising into the blue sky. Brad gunned the engine and drove toward it, a wave of relief so profound it almost made him pass out. The plow stopped as he approached. The driver, a man named Gary, his face hidden behind a thick beard and sunglasses, leaned out of the cab. "What in God's name?" Gary started. Brad didn't have the strength to explain. He just pointed back the way he came. "House, 2 miles. I have 2 men. 2 men tied up in my basement." Gary stared at him. Just then, a Michigan State Police cruiser, which had been following the plow, pulled up. The door opened, and a young, sharp-eyed officer stepped out, his hand on his weapon. "Sir, what's going on here?" the officer, Trooper Hayes, asked, his voice cautious. Brad slid off the snowmobile, his legs buckling. He leaned against the machine, his good hand raised. "My name is Brad. I live in the old Hemlock place," he said, his voice shaking. "There was a situation. 2 men broke in. They're in my cellar. They're alive. There was a third. He ran. He's in the woods. And there's something else. Something in the mine. You need to call the FBI. You need to call the Secret Service." The next few days were a blur. His house was gone, swallowed by a swarm of federal agents. The entire property was cordoned off. They brought in massive vehicles, generators, and lights, turning the quiet woods into a small, bustling city. Brad sat in a warm motel room in town, his arm stitched and bandaged by a doctor, Ghost sleeping soundly on the floor by the bed. He had told his story over and over. First to Special Agent Brown, a no-nonsense FBI agent in a practical parka who was focused on the home invasion, the fight, and the men in the cellar. Then to Special Agent Harris, a man from the Secret Service who wore a suit under his parka. Harris was quiet, intense, and his questions were not about the fight. They were about the camera, the duct, the keypad, and the generator. When they finally breached the steel door, the agents were stunned. Brad's report had not prepared them for the scale. It was, as Agent Harris later told him, one of the most sophisticated counterfeiting operations they had ever seen in the Midwest, worth tens of millions. Cole and Rooker were taken into federal custody, their arrogance gone, replaced by the sullen, silent reality of their capture. Weeks passed. The snow slowly, grudgingly, began to melt. The great UP thaw had begun. A state police team following Brad's directions found what was left of Finch. The woods and the cold had done their work. The government seized the bunker. They compensated Brad for the house, which was still a federal crime scene. Agent Harris offered to relocate him to put him in witness protection. Brad declined. Spring came late, but it came. The federal agents were gone. The mine was sealed, this time for good, with a ton of concrete. The house was his again. It was quiet. Brad sat on the porch. He had fixed the broken door jamb. The wood was new, solid. He wore a simple unbuttoned blue plaid shirt over a gray t-shirt. The air was cool, but no longer hostile. It smelled of damp earth, new pine buds, and melting ice. He held a warm mug of coffee in his good hand. His left arm, though healed, was stiff. A long, puckered, angry red scar ran from his elbow to his wrist. At his feet, Ghost lay sleeping in a patch of pale spring sun. The shepherd's gray and white fur was thick, clean. He, too, had a scar. On his left shoulder, where the fur had grown back, a thin, white line of raised skin was visible, a matching set. Brad looked out at the forest. The trees were no longer a threat. They were just trees. The silence was no longer a void. It was just quiet. He had come here seeking a sanctuary, a place to run from the ghosts of Kandahar. But the UP had not offered him an escape. It had offered him a new war, a new siege. He had faced the storm, the one outside, and the one that had lived inside his head for a decade. He had felt the old, paralyzing panic, the memory of the Humvee. But this time, he had not been alone. He had looked at Ghost, and he had not been a soldier. He had been a protector. He was not running anymore. Ghost let out a soft sigh in his sleep, his paws twitching. Brad reached down, his hand marked by his own scars, and rested it on the dog's head. He had not found the peace he was looking for. He had found something harder and better, something real. He had found his home. In the end, the deepest scars are not the ones we can see. Brad's story reminds us that true peace isn't found by running from our storms, but by finding that one loyal soul who will stand with us in the dark. That is the unbreakable bond we celebrate here. If you were moved by the courage of Brad and Ghost, we would be truly honored if you would subscribe and join our community. We love to read your thoughts, so please share what part of their journey touched you the most. And now, the next story in our collection is already waiting for you, right on the screen.